A person stops belonging to themselves long before the chains ever touch their wrists. The black market station drifted in silence above the dying moon of Kepri. 9. Its rusted docking rings glowing dim red against the endless dark. Lucas Hale stepped through the crowded corridor with the stale taste of recycled air settling on his tongue, while neon signs flickered through the haze of engine smoke overhead. Somewhere deeper inside the station, old machinery groaned like a wounded animal. The place smelled of burnt circuitry, synthetic alcohol, and too many desperate people packed into one steel coffin floating through space. Lucas adjusted the collar of his weathered gray jacket and moved toward docking sector 12, boots echoing against the grated floor. His cargo hauler, the Wayfarer, needed a replacement reactor core before its life support failed for good, and Kepri 9 was the only station within 200 light-years that sold parts cheap enough for a man already drowning in debt. He hated places like this. Too many shadows. Too many eyes. Too many people willing to sell pieces of themselves just to survive another week. A burst of static crackled through nearby speakers, followed by laughter from a cluster of merchants gathered around a holoscreen displaying auction listings. Lucas ignored them until one word drifted through the noise and caught in his chest like broken glass. Noble-born. He slowed. Ahead, beyond a half-open security gate, an auction platform glowed beneath pale white lights. A line of figures stood silently on display while traders circled them like scavengers. Most kept their heads lowered. One did not. Lucas saw her immediately. Turquoise skin shimmered faintly beneath the harsh lighting, almost unreal against the cold steel room. Silver hair spilled over one shoulder in loose waves, partially hiding the metallic restraint locked around her throat. The collar blinked blue every few seconds with a low electronic hum. She stood taller than the others despite the restraints around her wrists, posture perfectly straight, violet eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the crowd. Not frightened, not begging, empty. A heavy-set alien male beside. The stage laughed while signing documents on a holographic pad. Gold rings covered his fingers. Defiant little thing, he muttered to another buyer. Cost me more trouble than she's worth. Lucas felt his jaw tighten. The translator in his ear clicked softly as another voice answered. Hard to believe she's your daughter. The male gave a careless shrug. Blood means nothing if the investment fails. Something cold settled in Lucas's stomach. The girl never reacted. She only watched her father with the stillness of someone already grieving a death that hadn't happened yet. Lucas should have walked away. He knew that. Reactor core. Fuel. Supplies. Get out. That was the plan. But then the auction handler grabbed the girl's chin and turned her face toward the crowd like merchandise under showroom lights. The collar sparked faintly against her throat. For the first time, emotion flickered across her features. Not fear. Humiliation. Tiny. Barely visible. But Lucas saw it, and somehow that made it worse. Starting bid at 40,000 credits, the handler announced loudly. House-trained. Educated. Genetically compatible with most Central System species. Noble lineage verified. Lucas looked away, disgust curling in his chest like acid. Around him, bidders casually raised digital paddles while discussing her the same way mechanics discussed engine parts. The girl finally spoke, her voice low and smooth despite the collar around her neck. Father. The nobleman glanced up lazily. What? Her glowing violet eyes never left his face. I hope the money was enough. The room went quiet for half a second. Then the bidding continued like nothing had happened at all. Lucas stared at her while the station lights flickered overhead. Outside the viewport behind the auction block, distant stars burned silently across the dark. And somewhere deep inside his chest, something old and tired suddenly refused to let him walk away. The auction resumed around him with the dull rhythm of machinery that had forgotten shame a long time ago. Numbers flashed across holographic screens while traders murmured over prices in half a dozen languages, but Lucas barely heard any of it. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl standing beneath the white lights. Leary Elviation. The name glowed across the listing beside her image along with a string of genetic records, education certifications, and noble registry seals that made her look less like a person and more like cargo waiting for shipment. Lucas exhaled slowly through his nose and rubbed a hand across the stubble on his jaw. 40,000 credits. More money than he had left in the entire system. His ship needed repairs. His navigation array barely functioned. Two of the life support filters were held together with salvage wire and stubborn optimism. Buying a reactor core had already been a desperate gamble. Buying a stranger was insanity. Interested, human? A voice asked beside him. Lucas glanced over to find the auction clerk studying him with thinly disguised amusement. The alien's yellow eyes reflected the scrolling bids overhead. Noble blood always attracts attention, especially this close to the core worlds. Lucas looked back toward the platform. She does not look interested. The clerk barked out a laugh. Interest is not required. Another bid appeared. 48,000. Someone in the back raised their paddle without even looking up from their drink. Lyriel remained perfectly still. Lucas noticed the faint tremor in her fingers now. Tiny. Controlled. The kind of person only saw when someone was trying very hard not to show fear. Her father signed another document and turned away from the stage entirely, already bored with the transaction. That hit Lucas harder than he expected. Not anger. Something colder. The kind of exhaustion that came from seeing too much cruelty passed off as normal business. He remembered another station years ago during the border wars. Refugees lined against steel walls waiting for transport while officers argued over fuel costs. Children trading food rations for blankets. Men pretending not to notice. The galaxy always found new ways to measure the value of a life. 50,000, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear 52? Lucas closed his eyes for half a second. Then he cursed quietly under his breath and stepped forward. 60. The room shifted. Several heads turned immediately toward him. The auctioneer blinked in surprise before grinning broadly. A serious buyer. Lucas ignored the stares pressing against him from every direction. Somewhere behind the stage, a ventilation fan rattled loudly through old ducts while neon lights buzzed overhead. Lyriel finally looked directly at him for the first time. Her glowing violet eyes narrowed slightly, studying him the way someone might study approaching weather. Not hopeful. Careful. Another bidder hesitated before raising their paddle. 62. Lucas felt his stomach tighten. Every credit disappearing from his account echoed through his head like metal doors slamming shut. Reactor core gone. Repair money gone. Fuel reserve gone. Rational thought screamed at him to stop. Instead, he heard himself say, 70. Silence followed. Even the auctioneer paused this time. The competing bidder lowered their paddle with visible annoyance. Lucas knew why. Nobody wanted damaged cargo expensive enough to become inconvenient. The clerk beside him chuckled softly. Congratulations, human. The auctioneer struck the platform rail with an electric gavel. Sold. The sound cracked through the chamber like a rifle shot. Lucas stood motionless while transfer screens flickered alive around him. Across the platform, Lyriel stared at him without expression. Then her gaze drifted down toward the glowing collar around her throat before returning to his face again. If you expect gratitude, she said quietly as security escorts led her toward him, you will be disappointed. Lucas met her eyes beneath the cold station lights. Good, he replied. I did not do this for gratitude. The docking bay outside Kepri. 9 trembled faintly beneath the constant vibration of departing freighters while Lucas guided Lyriel through rows of stacked cargo containers toward landing pad 47. The station lights overhead flickered through layers of industrial haze, washing everything in dull orange and pale blue. Somewhere nearby, a cargo hauler ignited its engines with a low thunder that rattled loose bolts across the metal floor. Lyriel walked half a step behind him in complete silence, the electronic collar around her throat pulsing softly against her turquoise skin every few seconds. Lucas could feel people staring as they passed. Some looked curious. Others looked amused. A few looked disappointed they had not won the auction themselves. He hated all of them equally in that moment. The Wayfarer sat near the far edge of the docking ring, old and scarred beneath the station floodlights. Its dark hull carried burn marks from solar storms and years of rough freight routes through the outer colonies. One of the landing stabilizers hissed steam into the cold air, while warning lights blinked lazily along the cargo ramp. Lyriel slowed when she saw the ship. This is yours? She asked quietly. Lucas keyed open the loading hatch. Unfortunately, she studied the vessel for another moment. It looks tired. Lucas snorted softly. That makes 2 of us. The cargo ramp lowered with a metallic groan. Warm recycled air drifted out carrying the familiar scent of machine oil, old coffee, and overheated wiring. Home. Not much of one, but enough. Lucas stepped inside first and tossed his worn jacket across the cockpit chair before activating the interior lights. Half the overhead panels failed to respond. The remaining strips cast dim white illumination across the narrow corridor. Lyriel entered slowly behind him, her eyes scanning every detail with cautious precision. The restraint cuffs around her wrists clinked softly when she moved. Lucas noticed the sound immediately. He turned toward a storage locker mounted beside the galley and dug through scattered tools until he found a compact release key. "Hold still," he said. Lyriel instantly stiffened. The reaction was subtle but immediate. Her shoulders locked. Her breathing shallowed. Lucas paused. "I am removing the restraints," he said carefully. "Nothing else." Her glowing violet eyes searched his face as though waiting for a hidden condition beneath the words. After a long second, she finally extended her hands toward him. The metal cuffs unlocked with a sharp click. Red marks circled her wrists underneath. Lucas looked away before she noticed him seeing them. He crouched near the wall, terminal, and entered another override sequence. The collar around her throat emitted a warning tone. "That device is coded to your ownership signature now," Lyriel said softly. "If removed incorrectly, it sends an emergency alert to the station." Lucas kept working at the terminal. "Then it is a badly designed system. Most slave systems are." Her voice remained calm, but something hollow lived underneath the words. The override completed with a burst of static. A second later, the collar unlocked and dropped into Lucas's hand. The silence afterward felt strangely loud. Lyriel lifted trembling fingers to her throat as though she could not quite believe the weight was gone. Lucas crossed the room without speaking and placed the collar onto the galley counter beside a rusted coffee mug. Then he grabbed a folded thermal blanket from the storage shelf and set it gently near the small sleeping bunk against the far wall. "You can take the bed," he said. "I will stay in the cockpit." Her expression shifted slightly for the first time since the auction. Not relief. Confusion. "Why?" Lucas opened a cabinet and pulled out 2 sealed food packs. "Because you look like you have not slept safely in a long time." He handed one toward her. Lyriel stared at the offered meal as if it were another kind of test entirely. Outside the cockpit viewport, distant stars shimmered silently against the dark while Kepri 9 slowly drifted farther away behind them. And for the first time in what felt like years, Lucas Hale realized he had absolutely no idea what he had just brought aboard his ship. The Wayfarer drifted silently beyond the outer traffic lanes while distant stars stretched across the cockpit glass like frozen shards of light. Inside the aging cargo ship, the steady hum of failing ventilation systems filled the narrow corridors with soft mechanical vibration. Lucas sat alone in the pilot chair with one boot propped against the console, staring at a repair estimate blinking angrily across the main screen. Reactor efficiency had dropped another 3% since departure. At this rate, the ship would barely survive the next jump. He rubbed tired fingers across his eyes and glanced toward the dim hallway leading into the sleeping quarters. No sound came from inside. That worried him more than if she had been screaming. He had seen silence like that before during the war. People who stopped expecting kindness often became quieter than empty rooms. The thought sat heavy in his chest while he reached for the cold cup of coffee beside the controls. The liquid tasted burn enough to strip paint. Somewhere behind him, metal creaked softly. Lucas turned his head. Lyriel stood near the corridor entrance wrapped loosely in the thermal blanket he had left for her. The silver strands of her hair caught the pale cockpit lights while shadows softened the sharp exhaustion beneath her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The stars drifted slowly across the viewport behind him. "You should sleep," Lucas said finally. Lyriel leaned one shoulder lightly against the doorway. "I tried." Her voice remained calm, but there was strain underneath it now, thin and fragile as cracked glass. Lucas nodded once. "The engines are loud." "It is not the engines." He looked at her more carefully then. She held the blanket close around herself with one hand, while the other rested unconsciously near her throat where the collar had been only an hour earlier. Her fingers kept touching bare skin as though expecting to find metal there again. Lucas quietly set down his coffee mug. "You are waiting for the catch." Lyriel gave a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "There is always a catch." The cockpit lights flickered once overhead before stabilizing again. Lucas muttered something unfriendly toward the electrical system and reached beneath the console for a toolkit. Not this time. You say that very confidently for a human who just spent his entire savings on a stranger. He pulled open a maintenance panel. I have made worse financial decisions. To his surprise, Lyriel let out a small sound that almost resembled a laugh. It vanished quickly, but Lucas noticed it anyway. The silence afterward felt different now, less sharp around the edges. He worked quietly for several minutes while she watched from the doorway. The smell of heated wires drifted into the cockpit as he replaced a damaged relay chip with practiced hands. Outside the viewport, a distant cargo convoy crossed through the darkness like glowing insects moving between stars. Why did you do it? Lyriel asked suddenly. Lucas tightened a bolt without looking up. Do what? Buy me? The question hung heavily between them. Lucas sat back slowly against the chair and exhaled through his nose. I did not buy you. Her glowing violet eyes narrowed slightly. The station records disagree. The station also charged me 40 credits for fuel filters older than I am. I do not trust their judgment. Another faint smile touched the corner of her mouth before disappearing again. Lucas noticed she seemed almost startled by her own reaction, like she had forgotten what amusement felt like. He looked down at the discarded collar still sitting on the galley counter beside the rusted coffee mug. The blue indicator light had finally gone dark. Nobody should stand on a platform while strangers bid on their life, he said quietly. That is all. Lyriel stared at him for a long moment after that. Not suspicious this time. Not defensive either. Just searching. Somewhere deep within the ship, an old pipe rattled loudly before settling again into silence. Finally, she lowered herself carefully into the empty seat across from him, still wrapped in the blanket. Outside the cockpit window, the stars burned cold and endless against the black. But inside the failing cargo ship drifting through the dark, the silence no longer felt quite so lonely. The next morning aboard the Wayfarer began with the sharp hiss of escaping steam and a string of profanity echoing through the engine corridor. Lucas slammed a wrench against the side of a failing coolant valve while hot air rolled through the cramped compartment in suffocating waves. Red warning lights flashed across the ceiling every few seconds, bathing the narrow space in pulses of angry color. Come on, he muttered through clenched teeth. Do not die on me now. The valve finally locked into place with a metallic snap. The warning alarm faded into silence. Lucas leaned back against the wall and wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his thermal shirt. The engine room smelled like scorched copper and overheated machinery. Somewhere above him, the ship vibrated softly as it pushed through faster-than-light drift lanes toward the outer colonies. He stayed there for a moment, catching his breath, before hearing footsteps approach from the corridor entrance. Light. Careful. Lucas turned his head. Lyriel stood just outside the engine compartment, holding one of the ship's old metal water canisters in both hands. The oversized gray shirt he had left outside her bunk hung loosely over her frame, while silver hair fell freely around her shoulders. The sight startled him more than he expected, not because of how she looked, because she finally looked less like a prisoner and more like someone simply existing aboard the ship. She extended the canister toward him. You were making sounds that suggested mechanical suffering. Lucas accepted the water with a tired grin. That was me, not the ship. A faint trace of amusement flickered in her glowing violet eyes. It vanished quickly, but not before he caught it. He took a long drink. The cold water tasted faintly metallic, but it was still the best thing he had swallowed all morning. Thank you, he said. Lyriel nodded once before her gaze drifted toward the exposed engine systems around him. Pipes lined the walls in tangled clusters while cooling fans spun lazily overhead. Your reactor shielding is unstable, she observed quietly. Lucas sighed. You say that like it is surprising. I say it because one power surge away from catastrophic failure usually concerns most pilots. He laughed softly under his breath. I cannot afford concern right now. Lyriel stepped carefully into the compartment, eyes studying the damaged systems with surprising familiarity. Your coolant flow is uneven. Lucas blinked. You know engineering? Noble houses train their daughters in fleet operations. Her expression darkened slightly after saying it. Or at least mine did before deciding I was financially inconvenient. Silence settled briefly between them except for the low hum of engines beneath the floor. Lucas tightened another loose. both while Lyriel crouched beside a flickering diagnostic panel. "This relay is overloaded," she said. "If rerouted through the secondary grid, efficiency would improve by 12%. Lucas stared at her. "You figured that out in 30 seconds? She tilted her head slightly. "Was I incorrect?" "No." He looked at the failing relay, then back at her. "Actually, no." For the first time since boarding the ship, Lyriel seemed uncertain. Not fearful, just caught off guard by being acknowledged. Lucas handed her the small repair scanner beside him. "Show me." She hesitated only a second before taking it. Their fingers brushed accidentally during the exchange. The reaction was immediate. Lyriel recoiled backward hard enough to strike the edge of the metal wall behind her. The scanner clattered onto the floor. Lucas froze. Her breathing became shallow again, while instinctive panic flashed across her face before she forced it away. Old reflexes. Learned fear buried too deep to hide completely. Lucas slowly raised both hands away from her. "Hey," he said quietly. "It is okay." Lyriel stared at him in silence, ashamed anger flickering behind her glowing eyes. Not directed at him. At herself. Lucas carefully bent down and picked up the scanner without moving any closer. "Nobody is going to hurt you here." The engine room hummed softly around them, while distant stars drifted endlessly beyond the ship's outer hull. After a long moment, Lyriel finally stepped forward again and took the scanner back from his open palm. This time, when their fingers touched, she did not pull away quite as fast. 3 days passed in the quiet rhythm of drifting through deep space. The wayfarer groaned and rattled around them like an aging animal too stubborn to die. But somehow the ship kept moving forward through the endless dark. Lucas spent most of his hours repairing systems that should have failed years ago, while Lyriel slowly transformed from a silent passenger into an unexpected presence woven into the routines of the ship itself. It happened in small ways at first. A recalibrated navigation panel. A repaired coolant sensor Lucas had forgotten about. Warm coffee waiting beside the cockpit console before dawn cycles. None of it announced itself loudly. But Lucas noticed. He noticed everything. The galley lights flickered softly as artificial morning spread through the ship. Lucas sat hunched over the small metal table, tightening bolts into a cracked engine regulator while steam curled upward from a battered coffee mug near his elbow. Across from him, Lyriel studied one of the old Terran star charts he kept stored inside the navigation database. Pale blue holographic constellations reflected across her turquoise skin, while silver hair spilled over one shoulder. "Your maps are outdated," she said calmly. Lucas snorted without looking up. "That ship and I have a lot in common." To his surprise, she smiled slightly. It was still rare enough to catch him off guard every time. Not because it changed her beauty, because it changed the room around her. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed tired fingers across his eyes. "Get some sleep at all?" Lyriel tilted her head. "Some." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "That means no." She lowered the holographic chart slowly. "I am not accustomed to sleeping peacefully." The honesty in her voice landed heavier than he expected. No self-pity, no drama, just truth. Lucas stared quietly into his coffee for a moment before standing from the table. "Come on." Lyriel watched him cautiously. "Where?" "Cockpit." She followed him through the narrow corridor while the ship hummed softly beneath their feet. When they reached the cockpit, Lucas lowered himself into the pilot chair and activated the forward viewport shield. The armored plates slid open with a metallic hiss. Instantly, the stars flooded the cabin. Endless, silent, bright enough to make the darkness around them feel almost holy. Lyriel stopped moving. Violet light from a nearby nebula washed across her face, while distant galaxies shimmered beyond the glass like scattered fire across black water. Lucas adjusted the controls until the ship drifted into quiet autopilot. "When I was younger," he said softly, "I used to think space felt empty." Lyriel remained motionless beside him. "And now?" Lucas stared out at the stars. "Now I think maybe. People are the empty part." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward anymore. The kind built slowly through shared rooms and unspoken understanding. Lyriel lowered herself carefully into the co-pilot seat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke at all. The cockpit lights remained dim while stars drifted endlessly beyond the glass. Finally, her voice broke the quiet. "Why are humans kind of broken things?" Lucas glanced sideways at her. That is a complicated question. Then answer it simply. He considered that for a moment. Somewhere deep inside the ship, pipes rattled softly through the walls. Because most of us know what it feels like. Lyriel looked down at her hands resting quietly in her lap. In my world, broken things are hidden. Lucas leaned back against the worn pilot chair. In mine, we usually become mechanics. A soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Real this time. Warm enough to pull an answering smile onto Lucas's face. Lyriel noticed the smile immediately and seemed startled by it. As though she had not expected him to look at her that way. Not as property. Not as responsibility. Just as someone sharing the same quiet moment beneath the stars. Outside the cockpit, deep space stretched endlessly in every direction. Cold, vast, unforgiving. But inside the old cargo ship drifting between worlds, something small and fragile had begun to grow in the silence between a tired human pilot and the alien woman who no longer slept with fear in her eyes every night. The smell of burnt bread filled the galley long before Lucas realized something had gone wrong. He looked up from the navigation console just as gray smoke drifted lazily through the corridor outside the cockpit. "Ah, hell," he muttered, shoving himself out of the pilot chair. The wayfarer vibrated softly beneath his boots as he hurried toward the galley. Inside, Lyriel stood frozen beside the heating unit while a blackened piece of Terran toast sat smoking on a metal tray. The expression on her face looked so genuinely offended by the situation that Lucas nearly laughed before he could stop himself. "You burned it," he said. Lyriel crossed her arms tightly. "Your food preparation systems are primitive and hostile." Lucas finally lost the fight against the grin pulling at his mouth. "It is bread, not a tactical ambush." Her glowing violet eyes narrowed at him with mock irritation. "Your confidence disappears remarkably fast when your reactor begins leaking coolant." "Fair point." He stepped forward and disabled the overheated burner while smoke filters hissed alive overhead. The galley lights cast soft gold across the cramped room, catching silver reflections in Lyriel's hair while steam curled from a nearby kettle. Somehow the old ship felt warmer lately. Less like survival, more like living. Lucas opened a storage compartment and tossed her another ration pack. "Try this instead." Humans mastered the art of edible disappointment centuries ago. To his surprise, Lyriel smiled openly this time. Small, brief, real enough to tighten something unexpectedly deep in his chest. She leaned lightly against the counter while Lucas prepared fresh coffee beside her. Outside the nearest viewport, streaks of blue hyperspace shimmered endlessly past the ship like rivers of light. "You are different from what I expected," she said quietly after a moment. Lucas handed her a steaming metal cup. "That bad? That human?" He paused. "You spent your life hearing horror stories about us." Lyriel stared down into the swirling coffee. "My people speak of humans as dangerous creatures. Aggressive, reckless, emotionally unstable." Lucas took a sip from his own mug. "Most of that is fair. They never mention kindness." The words landed softly between them, honest enough that Lucas suddenly found himself unable to joke his way around them. He looked down at the coffee steaming in his hands instead. People usually leave the important parts out of history. Lyriel studied him quietly for several seconds. Then her expression shifted. The warmth faded slightly from her face like light disappearing behind clouds. Lucas noticed immediately. "What is it?" She hesitated. For the first time since boarding the ship, uncertainty touched her voice. "My father once told me kindness was only a negotiation tactic." Lucas leaned back against the counter slowly. "Sounds like a miserable man." "He was powerful. That is not the same thing." Silence settled over the galley while the ship hummed steadily around them. Lyriel stared out the viewport at the rushing hyperspace currents beyond the glass. "When I was 14, she said quietly, our house entered a trade alliance with another noble family. I heard my father tell one of his advisors that my appearance finally made me useful." Lucas felt something cold tighten behind his ribs. Lyriel continued staring outward, voice calm in the way people sounded when pain had become old enough to polish smooth. "He discussed my future the same way captains discuss cargo routes." The metal cup bent slightly in Lucas's grip before he realized how tightly he was holding it. He set it down carefully onto the counter. "He sold you for politics." Lyriel gave the smallest nod. "Debt, territory rights, military contracts." The details changed depending on which meeting I overheard. Lucas looked away toward the dim galley lights before anger could fully reach his face. The old ship creaked softly around them, while distant engine vibrations pulsed beneath the floor. Finally, he exhaled slowly through his nose. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "your father sounds like the kind of man I would enjoy throwing out an airlock." Lyriel blinked once in surprise. Then a sudden laugh escaped her before she could stop it, bright enough to fill the tiny galley with warmth. Lucas stared at her for half a heartbeat too long after hearing it. And judging by the way Lyriel suddenly looked down into her coffee afterward, she noticed that too. The lights aboard the Wayfarer died, without warning halfway through the evening cycle. 1 second the galley glowed with warm yellow light and soft engine vibration, and the next the ship dropped into complete darkness accompanied by a violent metallic groan somewhere deep below the floor. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Lucas muttered as emergency red lights flickered weakly alive along the corridor walls. The ship shuddered once more before settling into an uneasy silence broken only by the distant hum of backup systems struggling to stay operational. Lyriel steadied herself against the galley counter while crimson emergency lighting painted soft shadows across her turquoise skin. "That sounded expensive," she observed calmly. Lucas dragged a tired hand across his face. "Everything on this ship sounds expensive." He crossed into the maintenance corridor and opened a wall panel with practiced irritation. Sparks crackled faintly behind the exposed wiring. Power distributor overloaded again. Lyriel stepped beside him and crouched near the lower relay housing. "Your backup grid is compensating unevenly." Lucas glanced at her. "You are starting to sound emotionally invested in this disaster. I prefer surviving aboard functioning vessels." He laughed quietly under his breath. Together, they worked beneath the dim emergency lights while the old cargo ship drifted silently through deep space. Lucas adjusted power relays while Lyriel rerouted secondary systems through the damaged grid. Their movements gradually settled into an easy rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud, handing tools back and forth, quiet warnings before power surges, shared glances whenever the ship made a suspicious noise. It felt strangely natural, like they had been doing this far longer than a few days. After nearly an hour, the emergency system finally stabilized with a low mechanical hum. Fresh airflow pushed through the vents overhead. Lucas leaned back against the wall with a long, exhausted sigh. "There. She lives another day." Lyriel sat cross-legged beside the open panel, silver hair illuminated crimson beneath the emergency lights. "Barely." Lucas pointed a wrench toward her. "You are becoming judgmental. Your ship encourages honesty." The corner of his mouth twitched upward. He slid down the wall until he was sitting beside her on the metal floor, both of them surrounded by scattered tools and exposed wiring. The corridor remained dim except for the pulsing red glow overhead. Outside the hull, endless stars drifted silently through darkness. For a while neither spoke. The quiet between them no longer demanded filling. Lucas rested his head lightly against the wall behind him and closed his eyes. "You know," he said after a moment, "during my second year hauling freight through the frontier systems, I accidentally vented an entire shipment of luxury wine into open space." Lyriel looked over slowly. "Accidentally. Mostly accidentally." "Lucas." He grinned tiredly. The docking clamps failed. Crates bounced everywhere. One exploded into the ventilation system. Lyriel stared at him. "What happened?" The station air recyclers spread the smell through 6 docking levels. He rubbed the back of his neck. Security thought there was a chemical leak. Whole place went into emergency lockdown for 9 hours. For half a heartbeat, Lyriel simply blinked at him. Then suddenly she laughed. Not the careful, restrained laugh he had heard before. This one escaped freely, bright and warm enough to echo through the narrow corridor like music. Lucas found himself staring before he could stop. The sound transformed her completely. The guarded distance in her expression vanished for those few seconds, leaving behind someone younger, softer, alive in a way he had not seen since the auction station. Lyriel slowly realized he was watching her. Her laughter faded into embarrassed silence while crimson light reflected softly in her glowing violet eyes. Neither looked away immediately. Lucas became sharply aware of how close they were sitting. Close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her beside him despite the cold metal floor. Somewhere deeper inside the ship, The engines hummed steadily through the darkness. Lyriel lowered her gaze first. "You are staring," she said quietly. Lucas exhaled softly through his nose. "Yeah." She waited. "Why?" He looked at her beneath the dim emergency lights while distant stars drifted endlessly outside the hull. "Because that is the first real laugh I have heard from you," he said softly. "And I think this ship needed it." The proximity alarm shattered the quiet at 2:13 ship time. A sharp electronic pulse echoed through the Wayfarer, followed by the rapid flicker of warning lights across the cockpit consoles. Lucas jerked awake instantly from the pilot chair while the navigation screens lit up in angry red. "Symbols. What now?" he muttered hoarsely, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he leaned toward the radar display. The answer appeared 1 second later. 3 ships. Fast-moving. Closing hard from the edge of the outer sensor range. Lucas felt the exhaustion drain out of him immediately. Beside the cockpit entrance, Lyriel appeared already alert despite the late hour, silver hair slightly disheveled from sleep, while concern sharpened her glowing violet eyes. "What is happening?" Lucas studied the incoming transponder signals in silence. His jaw tightened. "Company." The Wayfarer vibrated softly beneath them, while warning tones pulsed through the dim cockpit. Outside the viewport, endless stars stretched silently across the black. Somewhere far behind them, 3 distant engine signatures burned steadily closer. Lyriel stepped beside him and stared at the radar screen. The color drained subtly from her expression. "Those are aviation escort frequencies." Lucas looked over sharply. "Your family. House security vessels." Her voice lowered carefully. "My father must have realized the station sale records were leaked." Lucas muttered something deeply unfriendly under his breath and reached for the flight controls. "How long until they catch us?" Lyriel studied the speed calculations. "Less than 2 hours in your current condition." Lucas leaned back heavily in the pilot chair. "Fantastic." The old cargo ship creaked around them as if personally offended by the situation. Lyriel remained motionless beside the console, staring at the approaching signals with quiet dread Lucas recognized immediately. Not fear for herself. Fear of becoming powerless again. He had seen that look before on people backed into corners with nowhere left to run. Lucas entered a manual course adjustment, pushing more power into the engines despite the reactor protests screaming across his display. The ship lurched forward slightly. "Lucas," Lyriel said quietly, "if they board this vessel, they will not treat you kindly for interfering. I figured. You should leave me at the nearest port." He looked at her then. Really looked. She stood perfectly composed while offering herself up like a problem that needed removing. As if somewhere deep inside she still believed her existence only created trouble for others. Lucas felt anger rise sharp and immediate in his chest. Not at her. At every person who had taught her to think that way. He swiveled fully toward her in the pilot chair. "Do you want to go back?" Lyriel froze slightly at the question. Outside the viewport, distant stars drifted slowly through darkness while the warning alarms continued pulsing softly around them. "No," she admitted after a long silence. The single word sounded smaller than he expected, honest enough to hurt. Lucas nodded once. "Then you are not going back." Lyriel stared at him as though the answer itself confused her. "You would risk your ship for someone you barely know?" Lucas snorted quietly and turned back toward the controls. "This ship is held together by duct tape, bad decisions, and caffeine. Risking it is basically tradition." To his surprise, a faint laugh escaped her despite the fear still shadowing her expression. Lucas smiled briefly before focusing again on the sensors. The incoming ships were gaining slowly. Military-grade engines against an aging freight hauler. Bad odds. Very bad odds. Lyriel stepped closer beside him, studying the navigation map. "There is a plasma storm belt 30 million miles ahead," she said carefully. Lucas glanced at the highlighted region and immediately frowned. "That route is unstable. So is your reactor." "Fair point." He leaned back slowly, considering the violent electrical storms churning across the mapped sector ahead. Dangerous enough most commercial pilots avoided it entirely. Dangerous enough pursuit ships might hesitate. "You think we can make it through?" Lyriel looked out at the stars beyond the cockpit glass before answering. "I think your ship survives mostly out of spite." Lucas barked out a tired laugh despite himself. Then his fingers tightened around the flight controls while deep space stretched endlessly before them. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let us go disappoint your family." The plasma storm appeared across the forward viewport, like a living wound carved into space itself. Massive rivers of violet electricity twisted through clouds of glowing cosmic dust, while violent bursts of blue light flashed deep inside the storm belt every few seconds. Even from thousands of miles away, the turbulence made the wayfarer tremble beneath their feet. Lucas tightened both hands around the flight controls and exhaled slowly. I officially hate this plan. Beside him, Lyriel studied the storm with calm concentration despite the tension visible in her posture. The dim cockpit lights reflected across her silver hair, while warning symbols pulsed across the navigation console between them. Behind the ship, the three pursuing vessels continued closing steadily through open space. Lucas could already see the faint glow of their engines against the darkness. If we remain on our current trajectory, Lyriel said quietly, they will intercept us before the next jump point. Lucas gave a dry laugh. Always good to hear encouraging news. He pushed more power into the engines anyway. The wayfarer groaned in protest. Metal shuddered through the hull, while temperature warnings climbed steadily across the reactor display. Come on, old girl, Lucas muttered beneath his breath. One more miracle. The cargo ship surged forward toward the edge of the storm. Static immediately crackled across the cockpit speakers. Outside the viewport, arcs of electricity flashed between clouds large enough to swallow Moon's hull. The entire ship vibrated violently as they crossed into the outer turbulence field. Warning alarms erupted instantly. Shields are fluctuating, Lyriel announced while gripping the edge of the console. Navigation sensors are losing calibration. Lucas fought the controls as the ship lurched sideways through the storm currents. Blue lightning exploded across the viewport close enough to flood the cockpit with blinding light. Yeah, he grunted. I noticed. The wayfarer dropped suddenly beneath a violent plasma wave that rolled overhead like a collapsing ocean. Loose tools slammed against storage lockers somewhere behind them. The smell of overheated wiring filled the cockpit. Lucas adjusted thrust manually while sweat rolled down the side of his face despite the cooling system struggling at full power. Another burst of turbulence slammed through the ship hard enough to throw Lyriel sideways against the console. Lucas instinctively reached out and caught her arm before she hit the floor. For half a second, neither moved. Emergency lights painted crimson across their faces while thunderous energy bursts echoed through the hull around them. Lyriel looked at his hand gripping her arm, then slowly up at him. Lucas released her immediately. Sorry. Do not apologize for keeping me alive. The words came softly, honest enough to settle heavily in the narrow cockpit. Before Lucas could answer, the proximity alarm screamed again. One of the pursuit ships had entered the storm behind them. They followed us, Lyriel whispered. Lucas checked the sensor readings. Only one. Another violent jolt shook the cargo ship as plasma currents slammed across the shields. The pursuing vessel appeared briefly through the storm ahead of them, sleek and silver beneath flashing arcs of blue electricity. Military class. Faster. Better armored. Lucas's jaw tightened. Hold on. He cut power suddenly to the port thrusters. The wayfarer dropped sharply through a spiraling current of plasma turbulence, while electrical fire exploded around the hull in violent streaks of light. Every warning alarm aboard the ship screamed at once. Lyriel grabbed the edge of the pilot chair to steady herself, while Lucas wrestled the failing cargo hauler through the storm with grim concentration. The pursuing vessel overshot their position by several thousand miles before disappearing into the electrical chaos above them. Lucas finally allowed himself one breath of relief. Then the reactor warning turned bright red. His expression darkened instantly. That is not good. Lyriel looked toward the flashing display. What happened? Lucas stared at the overheating reactor core readings climbing rapidly across the screen. The shielding took damage during that last dive. Another explosion of blue plasma illuminated the cockpit, while deep vibrations rattled through the ship beneath them. Lucas reached for the manual stabilization controls without hesitation. Lyriel watched him carefully through the flashing emergency lights. Lucas, she said quietly, if the reactor breaches, it will not. You do not know that. Lucas glanced sideways at her, while thunderous cosmic storms roared outside the viewport. Maybe not, he admitted softly. But I know I am not handing you back to people who treated you like property. Lyriel stared at him in silence while lightning illuminated the cockpit around them like shattered stars. And for the first time since leaving Kepri 9, fear was no longer the strongest emotion in her eyes. The reactor temperature climbed another 12 degrees in less than a minute. Red warning symbols flooded the cockpit displays while the Wayfarer shook violently beneath the pressure of the plasma storm surrounding them. Outside the forward viewport, blue lightning twisted across space in enormous spirals bright enough to bleach the stars from sight. Lucas worked the controls with both hands while sweat dampened the collar of his thermal shirt. Every alarm aboard the ship screamed like the vessel itself understood how close it stood to falling apart. "The shielding is collapsing," Lyriel warned from the engineering console. "If the reactor overheats completely, I know." Lucas's voice came out rougher than intended. Another violent surge slammed through the hull hard enough to throw sparks from the overhead panels. Smoke curled faintly through the cockpit air. Somewhere deep below them, metal groaned with a sound that felt almost alive. The pursuing vessel still lingered behind them inside the storm, though farther back now. "Careful. Waiting." Lucas recognized the tactic immediately. Let the storm weaken the cargo ship first, then collect what remained afterward. His jaw tightened. "Of course they are patient now," he muttered bitterly. Lyriel looked toward the sensor display before turning back to him. "Lucas." He did not look away from the controls. "What?" Her voice softened carefully. "There is an emergency escape pod in the lower cargo bay." Lucas gave a humorless laugh. "That thing barely qualifies as transportation. It is enough for one person." He finally turned toward her then. The crimson emergency lights painted tired shadows across his face, while distant plasma storms illuminated the cockpit in flashes of electric blue. "No," Lyriel stepped closer beside the pilot chair. "If you release the pod while the storm interference is strongest, my family's ships will lose the signal." Lucas stared at her for half a heartbeat before understanding hit him fully. "Absolutely not." "Lucas." No, his voice cracked through the cockpit sharper this time. The old cargo ship trembled violently beneath them, while reactor warnings continued flashing bright red across every console. Lyriel held his gaze steadily despite the fear still lingering behind her glowing violet eyes. "You said nobody should belong to another person," she said quietly. "Then let me make this choice myself." Lucas looked away first. He gripped the controls hard enough for his knuckles to pale beneath the emergency lights. Outside the viewport, violent waves of blue plasma rolled endlessly through the darkness like cosmic oceans tearing themselves apart. "You think I am going to throw you into space alone?" he asked softly. "I think you are trying to save me." "Damn right I am." Silence fell heavily between them except for the relentless alarms echoing through the cockpit. Lyriel stepped even closer now, close enough that Lucas could feel the faint warmth of her presence beside him despite the cold recycled air. "Why?" she whispered. Lucas laughed once under his breath, exhausted and disbelieving all at once. "You still do not get it, do you?" Another violent jolt shook the ship hard enough to dim the cockpit lights. Lucas reached instinctively toward her to steady her against the console. This time she did not pull away at all. His hand remained against her arm while the storm raged outside around them. "You are not cargo," he said quietly. "You are not debt. You are not somebody's bargaining chip." Lyriel stared at him in complete silence while blue lightning reflected across her turquoise skin like living starlight. Lucas swallowed once before continuing. "And I am not leaving you behind just because things got dangerous." Her expression shifted slowly then. The fear remained, but something else lived beside it now. Something warmer, more fragile. "You would die for someone you barely know?" she asked softly. Lucas looked at her beneath the flickering emergency lights while the reactor alarms screamed around them. "Lyriel," he said quietly, "I think I stopped thinking of you as a stranger a while ago." For one suspended heartbeat, neither moved. Then suddenly the entire ship lurched violently sideways as a massive plasma wave struck the hull. Lucas slammed back against the pilot chair while warning sirens erupted at maximum volume. The reactor display flashed critical. "Brace yourself," he barked instantly, shoving power into the failing engines. Outside the cockpit glass, the heart of the storm opened before them in a blinding vortex of blue fire and violent cosmic light. And directly behind them, the pursuing ship accelerated. The heart of the plasma storm swallowed the Wayfarer whole. Blue fire exploded across the forward shields, while violent currents twisted around the cargo ship, hard enough to make every bolt in the hull scream in protest. Lucas fought the controls with both hands as warning alarms overlapped into one continuous mechanical howl. The cockpit flashed between crimson emergency lights and blinding electric blue every few seconds, throwing sharp shadows across his exhausted face. "Reactor output is destabilizing," Lyriel shouted over the noise while gripping the edge of the console to stay upright. "I know." Sweat rolled down Lucas's neck as he forced the aging ship through another spiraling wave of plasma turbulence. The engines coughed violently beneath the floor. Somewhere behind them, one of the pursuit ships vanished briefly inside a burst of electrical interference before reappearing closer than before. Too close. Lucas's jaw tightened. "They are locking onto us." Lyriel checked the sensor readings and went still. "Lucas." Something in her tone made him glance sideways immediately. Her glowing violet eyes remained fixed on the navigation display. "What?" She hesitated only a fraction of a second. "There is one possible way to stop them." Another violent shockwave slammed into the hull before Lucas could answer. Sparks burst from the overhead panels while the cockpit tilted sideways beneath a surge of unstable gravity. Lucas shoved more power into the stabilizers. "This feels like the kind of idea I am going to regret." Lyriel stepped closer beside him. The Aviation Command protocols recognize only direct bloodline authority. Lucas frowned, meaning. Blue lightning illuminated the cockpit around them as she reached slowly toward the silver chain hidden beneath the collar of her shirt. From underneath the fabric, she pulled a small crystalline pendant glowing faintly violet in the storm light. Lucas stared at it. Intricate royal markings shimmered beneath the crystal surface like frozen starlight. "That is not jewelry," he realized quietly. Lyriel shook her head once. "It is a sovereign seal." The words settled heavily between them while the storm roared outside the viewport. "My mother was first heir of House Viation," she continued softly. "Before she died, she encoded her genetic authority into this seal." Lucas looked at her in disbelief. "You are saying you outrank your father?" "Legally, yes." Another violent tremor shook the ship. The pursuing vessel accelerated again through the storm behind them. Lucas stared at the glowing seal in her hand while realization slowly spread across his face. "Then why did he sell you?" Lyriel lowered her eyes briefly. "Because if I disappeared quietly enough, nobody would challenge his claim to leadership." Silence crashed through Lucas harder than the storm itself. He looked at her, then not as a runaway noble or frightened survivor, but as someone betrayed by the very people meant to protect her. Lyriel activated the crystalline seal against the cockpit console. Instantly, the ship's communication systems flared alive beneath the storm interference. A holographic crest exploded across every screen in brilliant violet light. The pursuing vessel immediately slowed. Lucas blinked. "Well," he muttered softly. "That got their attention." Lyriel's posture straightened slowly in a way he had never seen before. Calm, regal, powerful enough to silence the fear that had shadowed her since the auction station. She opened a direct transmission channel. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone finally remembering who she truly was. "This is Lyriel Viation, lawful first heir of House Viation. By blood authority and sovereign succession rights, I command all pursuit vessels to stand down immediately." The cockpit fell silent except for the storm outside. Seconds passed. Then the nearest pursuit ship abruptly cut engine acceleration. Another followed. Lucas stared at the sensor display in disbelief while the hostile lock warnings disappeared one by one. Lyriel slowly exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The plasma storm still raged violently around them, but something inside the cockpit had changed completely. Lucas looked at her beneath the flashing blue stormlight. "You could have used that authority earlier." Lyriel's fingers tightened slightly around the glowing seal. "I did not believe I deserved it anymore." Lucas felt something ache quietly in his chest after hearing that. Outside the viewport, cosmic lightning twisted endlessly through the darkness, while the pursuit ships drifted motionless beyond the storm currents. And for the first time since he saw her standing beneath auction lights on Kepri 9, Lyriel Viation no longer looked like someone waiting to be chosen by others. She looked like someone finally choosing herself. The plasma storm finally released them 6 hours later. The Wayfarer drifted out of the violent blue currents battered, overheated, and trailing enough smoke to embarrass any respectable spacecraft, but somehow still alive. Lucas leaned back heavily in the pilot chair while the last emergency alarms faded into exhausted silence one by one. The cockpit smelled like burnt metal and overheated circuitry. Across the console, reactor readings stabilized at levels that no longer threatened immediate catastrophe. "Well," Lucas muttered hoarsely, "I think she officially qualifies as indestructible now." Beside him, Lyriel looked out through the forward viewport where calm starlight stretched peacefully across the darkness once again. Behind them, the Viation pursuit ships remained motionless at the edge of the storm boundary, watching, waiting, but no longer chasing. The violet sovereign seal rested quietly in Lyriel's hand, its soft glow reflecting across her turquoise skin like fading moonlight. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. After everything the storm had torn apart around them, the silence felt strangely sacred. Lucas finally pushed himself out of the pilot chair with a groan and headed toward the galley. "Coffee," he announced tiredly. "If I am going to survive this day, I require industrial quantities of coffee." Lyriel followed behind him quietly while the Wayfarer hummed softly through open space. The ship felt different now. Not safer exactly, but steadier somehow, like it had finally stopped running. Lucas filled 2 metal mugs from the aging galley brewer while steam curled into the dim overhead lights. He handed one toward her automatically. Lyriel accepted it with both hands, her fingers brushing his briefly without fear this time. That tiny detail hit him harder than the storm ever had. They sat together at the small galley table while stars drifted silently beyond the nearby viewport. No alarms, no pursuit warnings, just the soft vibration of engines beneath the floor and the faint bitter smell of overcooked coffee. Lyriel stared quietly into her mug before finally speaking. "When we reach the core worlds, there will be formal hearings." Lucas nodded once. "Figured. My father will deny everything." "Also figured." A faint smile touched her lips. "Small, tired, real. There will be pressure for me to accept a political marriage after succession is restored." Lucas looked down into his coffee without answering immediately. Somewhere deep inside his chest, something tightened quietly against his will. "Makes sense," he said at last, though the words tasted unpleasant leaving his mouth. Lyriel studied him carefully across the table. "You sound disappointed." Lucas gave a dry laugh beneath his breath. "I am a freight pilot flying a ship held together by bad financial choices. I do not exactly compete with galactic nobility." Silence settled softly between them again. Then Lyriel reached into the pocket of her borrowed gray jacket and carefully placed something onto the table between them. A small metal ring, worn smooth around the edges. Lucas frowned slightly. "What is that?" "A ship coupling ring," she said softly. "From your engine bay." Lucas blinked. "You stole part of my ship?" "Borrowed." For the first time in days, genuine amusement warmed her glowing eyes again. "I repaired it." Lucas picked up the ring carefully. The metal had been polished clean, faint silver engravings etched delicately along its surface now. Viation symbols intertwined beside rough Terran lettering. His throat suddenly felt unexpectedly tight. "Lyriel." She looked at him steadily across the dim galley lights while distant stars reflected softly beyond the viewport. "My entire life," she said quietly, "people tried to decide my value before asking who I was." Lucas remained completely still. "You were the first person who saw me before seeing what I could be used for." The old cargo ship hummed gently around them, while silence wrapped softly through the small galley. Lucas looked down at the repaired metal ring resting in his palm, then slowly back at her. "So what are you saying?" Lyriel's smile came slowly this time, warm enough to erase the last shadows of fear from her face entirely. "I am saying," she whispered softly, "that if there must be negotiations about my future, I would rather choose my own husband." Lucas stared at her beneath the dim ship lights while the stars drifted endlessly outside around them. Then, for the first time since stepping onto Kepri 9 station, Lucas Hale laughed without exhaustion behind it. Quietly, honestly, like a man finally discovering that sometimes the universe gave something back when you chose kindness over fear.